Hello, I'm Pedro Mora from the Pacific Coast of Canada, bringing you Pacific.ca. Keith Archer, the Chief Electoral Officer of BC, speaks about the recently announced independent committee to study voting over the internet. We will also hear later on from other participants on the panel, which took place at the 2012 Annual General Meeting of the Union of BC Municipalities. Although electoral reform is not limited to voting on the internet, it is one of the possibilities of modernizing the electoral system. And this time, on this forum, we focus on internet voting.
At this time, Elections BC, as well as the recently convened panel on internet voting, hasn't taken a position as to whether internet voting is desirable or not, and therefore I didn't wish to convey the impression of being for or against internet voting by participating on the panel. At the end of August of 2011, Elections BC published a discussion paper on internet voting. The purpose of the paper was to begin to engage in discussions about the use of internet voting in some jurisdictions and to identify some of the challenges and opportunities that arise in adopting an internet voting solution in any jurisdiction. The discussion paper was intended to identify in a general way, some of the perceived advantages to internet voting and to balance this with a discussion of perceived challenges and potential risks. The discussion paper was not intended to be the last word on internet voting, quite the opposite. It was intended as a tool to open discussions on this topic in British Columbia. On August 7th of this year, I received a letter from the Attorney General and the Minister of Justice inviting me to convene a nonpartisan, and this is a quote, a nonpartisan expert panel to review best practices with respect to internet voting in other jurisdictions, to review best practices on internet voting in other jurisdictions, and to examine issues associated with implementing internet voting in British Columbia. I accepted the invitation. As an independent officer of the Legislative Assembly, I also indicated how I would proceed. And I agreed to do so as follows. First, I indicated that convening a panel to research and draft recommendations to the Legislative Assembly on internet voting is authorized pursuant to Section 12(2)(a) of the Election Act. Therefore, I'm acting within my statutory authority as an independent officer of the legislature in doing this work. Second, with respect to the scope of activities, the independent panel on internet voting will examine opportunities and challenges related to the potential administration of internet-based voting for provincial or local government elections in British Columbia. Third, the method for gathering input and feedback from experts and the public will be determined by the panel. I also indicated that once established, the panel will develop a work plan and the timeline for proceeding and reporting. Fourth, the panel will be composed of 5 members. With me as a chair, the 4 additional members will display independence and judgment, and the panel will include expertise in areas such as technology, cryptography, internet security policy, and electoral administration. The secretariat function is being provided by Elections BC. Finally, the budget costs are projected to be $420,000 to complete the work of the panel. I appeared on Tuesday of this week before the Select Standing Committee on Finance and Government Services, who voted to recommend authorization of this amount of funding to the panel. On September 10th, Elections BC issued a news release announcing the composition of the independent panel on internet voting. The panelists include the following: Dr. Constantine Bezhnasov, Associate Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of British Columbia. Ms. Leanne Crane, Chief Administrative Officer, Regional District of East Kootenay, and Chair of the Election Committee of the Local Government Management Association. Dr. Valerie King, Professor of Computer Science at the University of Victoria. And Mr. George Morfitt, formerly Auditor General of British Columbia. I should note that I did not seek the advice on the appointment of panelists from government or opposition, from political parties, or from other organizations. Members of the panel bring important technical expertise to their work and also bring a reputation for good judgment and a commitment to independence. Let me talk briefly about the work of the panel. The panel held its first meeting on Tuesday afternoon of this week. And in this meeting had the first opportunity to review our mandate and to begin to develop a work plan. At the moment, it's very early days in the work of the panel, and the work plan itself has not been finalized, not surprisingly. But I can advise you about some of the assumptions that have been discussed to date and which are in various stages of agreement. First is the starting point. We've agreed that the starting point for our work is the discussion paper on internet voting published in August 2011 by Elections BC and available on our website. This discussion paper achieves a number of objectives, including the following. It offers a definition of internet voting. It describes the current voting processes at the provincial level in British Columbia. Presents a number of case studies to illustrate the extent of internet voting in other jurisdictions. It identifies at a general level a number of the advantages of internet voting. Among these advantages that are identified in that paper are the issue of voter turnout, the issue of convenience of internet voting, and the issue of reduced cost and a reduction in administrative errors under internet voting environment. So these are all issues that are identified in our original discussion paper that was published last year. I think it's fair to say that those issues, as they were articulated in that paper, are preliminary and are at a higher level of generality than is required by the work of the panel. Secondly, it identifies at a similar level of generality a number of challenges associated with internet voting, and this list of challenges is longer in the discussion paper. It includes the following: the issue of accessibility, the matter of the equality of voting power, the issue of the secrecy of the ballot, the security of the ballot, the ability to audit the way in which ballots are cast, the issue of transparency of the voting process, and finally, the simplicity of the voting process. So again, these issues are raised in the discussion paper. They're dealt with fairly generally, and you're welcome to go and look at the discussion as it's presented in that original statement. So that's the starting point. We have this discussion paper. We're going to now roll up our sleeves and look in much more detail at some of these issues. So the agreement of the panel, in addition to this being the starting point, is to recognize that this is only the starting point, and that an analysis that may lead to recommendations for the province requires that these strengths and weaknesses be reviewed in much more detail. Thirdly, a third agreement of the panel is that it's imperative to move from the general to the concrete. From the general to the concrete. What does the evidence show about voter turnout in those cases that are relevant to British Columbia that have used internet voting? Fourthly, the panel has been discussing the issue of identifying appropriate comparative cases and exploring these cases in more substantial detail than we have done to date. Fifthly, given the mandate of the panel to focus both on the provincial and the local level, the agreement of the panel is to ensure that we have a focus at both of those levels. Sixthly, the panel has discussed the need to ensure opportunities to engage with individuals and groups who have significant expertise in the issues we're exploring. So we have a commitment to engage with individuals and groups who have an expertise in issues we're exploring. We are developing, we have already developed a very substantial bibliography of materials, and we want to both be in a position to review in detail those materials, but also to engage with individuals who may have contributed to the development of those materials. Seventh, we will focus on the relevance of our analysis to the British Columbia case. This is not an abstract review. This is not a hypothetical review. This is a review that's relevant to British Columbia. Eighth, we wish to identify appropriate mechanisms for public input into the work of the panel, and mechanisms for the panel to consider that public input. So again, it's early days on how this is going to be implemented. There's lots of ways in which one can try to assess public's views on issues, and the commitment of the panel at the early stage is a commitment to ensure that we seek public input and provide opportunities for public input and develop the capacity to process that public input so that it's fully understood. And then lastly, the end product of the work of the panel will be comprised of a report to the Legislative Assembly submitted by me on behalf of the panel. So those are the things that we've agreed to date. Again, I know it's very early days in our work, and it gives you a preliminary sketch of some of the issues that are on our agenda, and be happy to turn it back to Carrie to see if there's questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Archer. We do have time for a couple quick questions, if anybody has any.
Just a question, Googling the internet. Estonia used internet voting in 2005 and was the first country to do so. 10 years later, we're still trying to figure it out. Do we have to reinvent the wheel?
Are you assuming we're reinventing the wheel?
Yeah, I am.
So
because
why is it reinventing the wheel to establish a panel and to charge that panel to identify relevant cases and evidence to use to assess the application of internet voting techniques? Internet voting techniques have been used in some jurisdictions, and one of the questions that we'll want to explore in all cases is, how did it work? How did it come about? How did it work? How does that system differ from the British Columbia case? How is it similar? Do we have similar, to take one illustration which would be an obvious starting point for Estonia, do we have similar citizen identification capacity in British Columbia as is the case in Estonia? Do we have citizen identity cards? Do we have citizen identity numbers that are universal, that allow everyone, every eligible elector, to log in securely to a system? And I think in that case the answer is no. But the more general point is, if the assumption behind the question, as I understand it, is the issue's been resolved, it can be done, and our starting point is we don't know enough at this moment to know if it's been resolved sufficiently that it can be done appropriately in British Columbia, given our institutional environment.
The next speaker is Harry Neufeld, former Chief Electoral Officer for BC. He participated on the panel advocating for voting over the internet. We must realize, we must be clear that voting on the internet is about making easy for citizens to give away their political power to a few political representatives on elections day. Here is Harry Neufeld.
I have more liberty to speak freely than Keith did because I held a job that Keith did at one time, and now I'm not beholden to any strictures associated with being absolutely neutral in all opinions. I really do believe that internet voting is the future, but I also think that it needs to be moved towards carefully, deliberately, and with healthy public debate in the process. I think internet voting is the future because it's what Canadians expect. They expect flexibility. They expect that all services that are offered by the private sector, by the public sector, evolve with their changing expectations. And Canadians conduct a lot of business daily electronically. And Keith will find as you get closer to election, you start getting besieged by groups wanting you to speak to them and asking the question, why on earth are we still doing this with paper and pencils? Why can't we figure it out and do it electronically like we do our banking? Now, there's a big difference between electronic banking and internet voting, and I'll speak to that again later. But I remember one session in the spring of 2009, just before the election, where a group, which was mostly of people who were about 40 years my junior, listened to my answer about the complexities associated with introducing internet voting and sort of acknowledged the fact that, yes, this wasn't simple to do, but then gave me a litany of examples where it had been done, where it seemed difficult, and basically said, why don't you just figure it out? So I'm hope that Keith's panel has some of that in their mandate, that figuring it out is an important part of this equation. An essential part of moving to internet voting, I think, is preserving the integrity of the system we have now, which is paper-based, but has an extremely good record of having transparency. The process ultimately needs to be understandable, it needs to be transparent, it needs to be equitable and accessible. And that perhaps means that we can't move in one step to internet voting for all people. Not everybody is conversant with the internet, but the criticism I keep hearing about old people won't vote this way was absolutely not the case when I was the independent third-party auditor for 2 internet voting elections for political parties in Canada. Old people voted in droves. They tend to prefer the telephone internet voting method over the web browser method, but that wasn't universal either, and it did not present challenges for them. I think that the administration of internet voting needs to be, continue to be, as it is now, independent and impartial. I worry about the possibility of vendors capturing the market and holding all the cards in terms of how the process works. I don't think that's acceptable for public elections. And I think that candidates and political party organizations, I know political party organizations aren't the norm for a lot of municipalities, but they are in some areas. They need to be able to scrutinize and observe every step of the way in the voting process, and nothing should be held secret from them. And they need to be perhaps trusted with not sharing some of the technical aspects of what they learn, but being brought in under the tent to see how the mechanisms actually work. There are, generally speaking, I think, 3 big challenges in moving to internet voting. The first one is reliable authentication. Right now, pretty much across Canada, you need to be registered, and your name needs to appear on the voters list. And then you need to prove that you are who that person is identified on the voters list. And a very important first step, which I think just about across the entire country we're well ahead with, is having electronic registration files, having a register of voters that is electronic. And even jurisdictions that still go door to door and do enumeration, as in Alberta, have moved to completely electronic record keeping for producing the voters list. The voters list you'll see when you go to vote is still on paper. You know, your name gets struck off by pencil and a ruler, just like it did in 1890, but you know, the voters list itself is computerized. Now, authentication is basically a voter needing to be registered and then being able to prove who they say they are, and that gets a little bit complicated when you're dealing remotely with a voter on an electronic device. And there's a lot of controversy about what standard is good enough. You're going to hear some examples of what Etobicoke has done, and you'll have to ask yourself whether you think that is a standard that's adequate for municipal elections, provincial elections, or national elections. The second really big challenge, and Keith mentioned this, is preserving the secrecy of the vote. Now, this is the area where there's a decoupling of who you are, this authentication, and needing to be able to absolutely know that you are who you say you are and that you're qualified to vote. You then need to separate that from how you vote. And something that is a feature of BC electoral law is that you can never be compelled to tell anyone, including a judge, how you voted in an election. The ballot secrecy is that seriously ingrained into both the fundamentals of our electoral system and the legislative framework that protects it. Secrecy of the vote is one of a number of standards that are been established internationally for what democratic elections are, and they include regular, free and fair elections, the commitment that one person has one vote and only one vote, that they're not coerced into voting a particular way, and finally, that their vote is secret. And these are fundamental principles, and they all need to be respected. But I think where there's a real challenge for internet voting is on this last issue of decoupling who you are from how you voted. And then the third large challenge is security and transparency overall on the mechanics of the system, and being able to prove that votes truly were counted as cast. The system that's used for internet voting must be reliable, and it's got to be accessible. It has to remain accessible throughout the voting period. We'll get some feedback on this, but I think the security of the data and prevention from cyber attacks must be absolute. And I also believe that audit checks must be available to demonstrate votes could not be manipulated after they were submitted. So, how do you get there? Well, I think part of getting there is sessions like this. And I think there needs to be a real acknowledgement that there are risks no matter what you do in terms of changing an election process. There is no zero risk process that I know of. We have risks now in our existing system. It is possible to vote more than once. It is possible to have votes cast by people other than those who are registered. But on the balance of things, legislators and policymakers and election administrators have said the features in the system that permit this kind of abuse are not of a significant nature that we shouldn't permit things like voting by mail, things like people vouching for others in terms of their identity, things like registration on the day of the election. I think as well that internet voting should be supported with pilot efforts, and I think those pilot efforts should be extremely well planned, extremely well documented, and I think that the political players should be allowed to have their scrutineers involved in the pilots very closely, and I think the critics need to be allowed to come in and participate and be part of the public debate about all the fears that they have that the internet-based election is not going to adequately protect some of the principles of truly democratic voting. I think there needs to be a conscious development of standards, and the panel that Keith is chairing, I think, has an opportunity to do a very good job there in terms of establishing what a baseline of internet voting standards might be for British Columbia, and for that matter, for the rest of the country. And there needs to be some, I believe, recognized independent audit processes for any internet voting. Finally, there's the whole debate about, are we going to buy these services from vendors that make it available? And I think in the short term, that's likely the only realistic option. Are we going to have each jurisdiction build their own internet voting application? Or is there an opportunity to share something like an internet voting utility between jurisdictional levels and do this once really well in the public interest? I put up a quote from, I'm told, a famous British politician about the nature of progress, and how first you get ignored, and then you're told you're mad, and then dangerous, and then after a pause, nobody disagrees anymore. I'm happy to say that I've been talking about internet voting in one way or another for quite a long time, and I'm at the point where they're calling me dangerous, but that's progress. Thank you so much.
Voting on the internet is an inevitable technological development being adopted all over the world. Carefully managing it, not like a business from a for-profit provider, but rather like a democratic public service, is more important than high-tech itself. In other words, not just the economic advantage or the efficiency of technology, but most important of all is who is operating it. If you can change your vote when you change your mind, that is what democracy is all about. Now polling.ca. Perpetual democracy doesn't mean that you have to vote every day. It just means that you have the right and the ability to vote anytime you want. And that is what perpetual democracy is all about.